of the purposes of infrastructure is to enable you to do things you previously couldn't do, for whatever reason it is. That's why they're invented. You know, why did the Romans invent getting water to cities? Because it was very much more convenient than bringing it in, you know, in jugs. And I think, in a way, that the kind of one of the purposes is that we can identify where a need exists and invent an infrastructure to support that need. But we also know about loads of infrastructures. You know, railways, trams, buses have been around for a long, long time, haven't they? We kind of know how they sort of behave, but we could also imagine how they could behave with extra capacity.
So this place, Carl, would you say with all these groups that you've got, that it represents a particular demographic that you have? What have you got? So that's one question. Yeah, the other question is, can you use that in order to, at the moment, it's you can find out what's going on and actually you can connect those things up to a point in terms of what's relevant, which is great. But can you also use it if you actually want to inquire, if you actually want to consult about something? I mean, if Raf has a fantastic project going, is that one of the networks that he could use in order to, shall we say, engage, consult, and you know, get design guidance or solution guidance?
Well, I mean, the other idea I was kind of trying to link this to, and it's linked in our minds, but obviously there's a massive gap between the idea and kind of delivering at the moment, is that if you segment the population so that you can have, you know, you have these kind of partnership groups in each locality, each place, if you like. That group is currently working with transport representatives and the neighbourhood team and the city councillor, and they've got health and care representatives on the boards who are bringing health concerns with them. And the calendar really is a kind of virtual representation of the networks that we brought together. That's why we're seeing it as our key asset mapping tool. So we started out with a spreadsheet of everyone and their names and addresses and all the headings. Now anyone in the community can go and find out who's in the partnership, because people in the partnership have got things on the calendar. Because basically our partnership, to be a member of the partnership, the Age-Friendly Human Mossite Partnership, all you have to do is attend an event or put something on the calendar.
Can I ask how are the outputs from what you're doing? How and who are they communicated to? What are the outputs being used for?
Well, currently, so I mean, it's obviously it's a pilot project in many ways, because we're trying about 10 different things. The main point of the project is to try and reduce social isolation, and that's what our funders have paid us to do. So the boards are kind of co-producing lots of activities in the area, spending a fund that they've got to create lots of activities. Yeah. So that's the main point of it. And there's an evaluation behind that and all the rest of it. But actually, because of who we are, we set up what we call an action plan. So the pilot of the pilot, basically we worked with Southway Housing Trust, and there was an action plan created which brought together all the different research kind of methods, and then it created a plan with all the things that 141 different actions they wanted to do in the area, which varied from changing the housing stock proportion to changing the signage to make the area more legible, to putting in some benches, to to lots of social projects as well.
I'm thinking, to sort of go back to the examples that we were talking about in terms of how the process has worked well through a client-led approach. The outputs of you're gathering a huge amount of data and information and a huge amount of people, which is fantastic, and most either private developers and then suggest even with maybe the city council don't have the resources or the time or the money to be able to do the kind of work that you're doing. And part of I think the interesting aspect that a group like this could potentially do as an outcome is connect all of this together, because there's a huge group of clients that we all work with. There's obviously a huge group of people and other stakeholders that you work with at the council who don't see this stuff.
No.
And if they did, and they understood it, and they understood how their piece of real estate, if you like, fitted into this wider set of needs and requirements, it might be easier to facilitate the kind of connected response to an area, as opposed to a piecemeal approach which says we need a building here, a building here, a building here, and everything in between is infrastructure, which is a local authority dictated thing, which is about transport mapping. As long as we don't overburden this junction, everything's fine. Because as you say, the reality when you actually speak to people is very specific. It's like, I know this junction is a problem, even though you're telling me it isn't, because I live here and I see it every day. I think there must be some way of stitching that together. I was wondering whether a kind of forum that actually involved people who commission designers would be quite an interesting one, because that's the kind of group who really have a lot of the power and control, if you like.
I think this is a very, very important point, because and you said it before, Casper, that a lot of the Innovate UK stuff, a lot of the European money is based on solutions that are then sellable and cookie cuttered. Well, it's not the solution and the thing which is sellable and cookie cuttered, it's the methodology and the tools that can be taken to somewhere else so that something can emerge from its specific place or time in which you're actually looking at it, which I think is really, really important. The other thing, you're quite right in terms of who commissions stuff. The decisions on projects are made way beyond the architect actually enters the conversation. The decisions are made by large organisations like Deloitte. Now, what's quite interesting is they often consult architects and designers to actually come forward with certain solutions. So the question is, as a profession, and other designers, to actually engage at that much, much, much earlier stage on those projects, both at a city council level and a policy making level, beyond just planning, but at a forward planning level, and the DNA of what the city is on a policy level, but also within those that clients commission at a very early stage before we even enter. For me, the plan of work has two arrows at either end. One is front end, pre-brief stuff where we enter that stuff, and the other side is actually feedback loops where we learn from what we do and feed it back into that front end. That system isn't necessarily there. And maybe that's the innovative bit, maybe that's the bit that, sort of the Innovate UKs and things should be perhaps looking at.
I think what Rob raises there is important in terms of the creative sector as a whole, and what Andrew raised at the beginning, which is, that there's a difficulty in the government policymakers seeing the creative sector as being legitimate in terms of what it brings to industry. But I think sitting around this table, we all know that we have an awful lot to add to just one example that Rob said, which is about policy. How do we influence policy? Because creative thinking is really valuable in policy. So, and we do legitimate research that has an impact in those areas. And I think, I don't know what you feel about this, Andrew, but that there is an opportunity for the research that we do to influence things like policy, and to raise the quality of debate around that, if you like, rather than just being seen as people who make pretty things, or indeed pretty buildings in a space that is already designated and where the infrastructure is committed.
But it's all about tying together this sort of data-rich sort of analysis of what's needed, what's lacking, what's wrong, what's incorrect, what doesn't work for people, and the sort of emotional response that Nick talked about in South Shields,
North Shields,
where you're dealing with people kind of on the ground, sort of working on a kind of an emotional and a sort of historical, sociological connection sort of basis. You tie the two things together, and you've got kind of a really interesting sort of proposition. This idea about 11 separate sort of data gathering activities taking place just seems crazy to me. And maybe what could come out of it would be somehow tying all of that information and data that's together, that's kind of available to create this, the Magister model or whatever it is that people can use to sort of communicate with communities, with the boroughs and with all the people that are using the city.
Well, what is really interesting in this conversation, and I'm listening as a past president of the RIBA, is we haven't mentioned design.
Well, I was
and I am really, really delighted, because my own view is that architects do design for a very small part of their working life, and the rest of the time it's research, it's communication, it's administration, and it's many other things. I actually really agree with you, Roy, about looking. We've got stage 1 and 0 and 7, and they've been put there for a purpose, and we need our clients to understand what that purpose is, that they will benefit, they will reduce risk, and more can come out of it. It's 2 and 2 making 22, actually, on this one.
We're in a really strange position in both. This picks up on a couple of points. So when I talk to the policymakers at Senior Council, they don't know whether to see us as academics or service providers, because we took on the contract to do the delivery for the age-friendly
That's
neighbourhoods.
because architects are really strange people.
Yeah. So they you know, so they're kind of like, So even though, so on one level they're telling us what to do, and then on another meeting we're telling them what their strategy should be, and they find that a little bit difficult at times. And then when we sit back within the School of Architecture, you know, it'll be familiar to everybody, that you know, the notion that that design can be research as well is still something that people find difficult to understand.
Yeah, could I just pick up on your point? I think it's interesting, the distinction that you draw, and you say architects, designers, only a small part of their work. I think designers across the board. I think all of the things that you mentioned are part of design. And all of the other people in other sectors of design also have to, I mean, the engaging with the community, the politics. Half of the politics of any design job, or half of any design job, is the politics. If you don't get it right, you'll never have the chance to do a decent job. And the research is very much part of the engagement and so on. I think it's all of those things. But I think we're getting to a really interesting point. If I could just try and clarify what Rob was saying, that in a way you're saying, if we can get the profession, shall we say the design community, let's put it even more broadly, the design community, consulted at an earlier stage, in terms of the thinking and the planning of what might be. But if then, as the design community, we have a way through communities and networks and so forth that we're creating of getting community engagement. Because the question is, how do you get community engagement? Is it Raf's job, and is it Michael's job? Is it, you know, Sir Howard's late departed job to get the community engagement? Or is that actually what we do as designers? You know, basically, we're designers designing for the end users.
The
So
danger seems to become counter-innovation, because the thing is that you end up with a situation like the Ford quote, if I'd asked people what they want, they would have said faster horses. So, you know, you need to engage properly and not just engage. It can't be tokenistic. You know, it always worries me, you know, Basil Jett's report on design and technology and things, and then the reduction in the number of people studying it. Well, that's fine. You don't have to study it. You go to business school and drive the creative economy and have it. It doesn't work, because what that would do is it would end up with that same situation where you would consult. You wouldn't put any. You say the community has designed this project, so therefore you would have something which is the faster horses thing. So I think, you know, it needs to be looked at in a you know, from a methodology point of view. I think is the key to pull some of these things together.
So surely, rather than saying that the community has designed it, what you're aiming to do is to get the community to design the problem, and then our job as architects is to find the answer.
Usually, the more information you have around a problem, the more helpful it is to try and solve the problem, isn't it? And after all, design is a series of problems that need to be creatively resolved and solved.
One of the designerly thinking, the problem which is expressed may be from a designer's point of view. So for me, looking at this, the problem may be an expression of a much deeper problem, or there may be a return on the investment of time and money on something which is an opportunity which would dwarf that problem and bring a much bigger return. So you can't always say, this is the problem, the community said this is a problem, this is what we need to go for. You need to understand it, dissect it, communicate that with the community itself. But we can't just be driven by problems that are brought up by, you know, the community said, therefore we can see it's not, but they've said, so we're going to. So there's a balance between the two.
Absolutely, there has to be a kind of an arbitration of, you know, relevance and a kind of weighing of the balance of benefits of the various solutions. But I think it's just interesting when you engage with people how much buy-in you get. You know, you talked about how do you get people to participate. Actually, everybody that we come across cares quite deeply about where they live and where they work. And the St Michael's example is an interesting one, because suddenly the whole city felt quite defensive all of a sudden about something, and you could see bubbling away at the surface that kind of response. And you know, I guess we've probably all felt it as architects at some point. You come across people who have very strong opinions. Sometimes it's negative opinions about what you're trying to do. It's not always necessarily going to drive the outcome, but it drives the discussion, the conversation, and the more people that you can kind of bring on board, I think the better in terms of engaging with the community, which is kind of the...
Forgive my ignorance, how many people typically, when you're building when you're at that stage of consultation, how many people, when you get your big piece of A0 paper and all the Sharpies, how many people are around?
Well, it varies a lot. So in the example that I gave in North Shields, it was quite a large community group. It was probably at least 100 people, but split into kind of subgroups.
Right.
And the client kind of managed that, facilitated that process.
And is that at a particular stage and then it stops and then...
That was, no it wasn't, it was a series of workshops that happened throughout the design process, but that was right at the beginning, before we'd had a chance to even analyse the site.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really good.
Which is where it really worked quite well.
I wonder if it should happen later as well. We talked about bringing people in earlier, but should it be a more continual thing? Should it happen as the thing's built? After the thing is, you've delivered this fantastic scheme, I guess there needs to be more. At that point, nobody's paying you to paying any of us to do that consultation, but perhaps there's a need there.
There's usually quite a disappointing end to a lot of projects. This is a kind of public building or cultural building, and particularly residential projects, where they kind of fizzle out, don't they? They're suddenly privatised, and even as the architect or the designer, you can't access the building anymore, and it's really disappointing sometimes, because you want to see how somebody's laid their furniture out in an apartment. Because it's interesting.
We tend to get involved as much as we can with the local schools. We find that's one of the best ways, as well as all the other stuff, but actually to revisit and to keep a track of progress and to be able to go back and review, and actually then if you build that relationship with the local schools, it tends to be a very good thing, because actually the children that are just starting out at that school, by the time you've actually finished, packed up and gone home, can kind of work their way through it. So I think the question you asked about the number of people that attend those events is quite interesting, because when we are told to do consultation by a local authority, they stipulate the catchment. They say, this is the catchment, you send your letters out, this is the area of people you need to consult. How do they define that? I don't know. So there's a kind of not very much spoken about rules of a statement of community engagement that people do as a kind of box ticking thing.
And it's also, I guess, interesting, the obligation to take on board the outcomes of that, and whether, if you are seeing yourself as a role curator of this information,
well, often a lot of it's lost because a lot of the outcomes that you get through these things are about much wider issues, kind of issues that you're probably finding out about. So, the consultation will be about a particular building, but the outcomes are, this park over here doesn't feel very secure at night, and because it's closely associated, people feel that it's part of the place, which rightly it is, but you can't.
That'd be lovely
you can't
to create a
go outside
mechanism.
of your remit in those kind of
that'd be
situations.
great to do something with that information, because that's rich information that you're just going to sort of write down, obviously record, and then, but if it's not your part of your role.
It's kind of reverse master planning, isn't it?
But I mean, and that's the problem, that we sort of participate in a confrontational environment with the families. It's not and that's what virtual places that create a spirit of participation through all the activities of a community. You get probably better outputs than you go in and say, we're going to build this, and half of them say we don't like it, the other half we like it, and then
perhaps one of the things we should be thinking about, as well as large projects that obviously involve whole communities and that have a massive impact, is that actually in order to engage communities and engage people in their local place, actually some of the small projects are perhaps where we should be turning some attention to, or more attention to as well, in that a lot of those projects are actually things that people care deeply and passionately about. and that actually community groups, community organisations will often come up with the idea, the concept, they'll approach the owning body, they'll approach the public sector, they'll approach their local councillor, and want to take a project forward as part of their kind of social infrastructure within their neighbourhood. And actually, if that is supported and successful, and people kind of are able to prove to themselves, prove to others that that actually it works and it can be delivered, and that they can actually take a project through to fruition and realise their vision. Actually, that does help build community cohesion. It helps kind of people then to engage in some of the bigger projects and with confidence that they're going to be heard. And I think something that Stefan said earlier about the support that's been given to a number of the community groups in terms of ICT skills, developing kind of the ability to use kind of Google Calendar and so on in terms of recording what they're doing and how they do it, making it public, is really, really key. I think particularly in relation to commissioning, developing ideas for and delivering actual projects that a community group themselves might actually be trying to do. One of the biggest barriers is that actually a lot of the language that's used, a lot of the forms that people have to fill in for kind of funding bodies, they are in a language and require a language that is very much coming from a middle class educated background. And that if you don't come from that background and you can't fill the form in using particular language and in a particular way, you don't get the money and your project doesn't happen. And actually one of the biggest barriers to communities feeling that they can engage with a lot of these projects is language. And you know, people can't express, or people aren't able to express necessarily as well as a very, very literate, kind of well-educated, wealthy community, what their needs are, what their aims are, what their objectives are. Even though actually in a deprived community where people haven't got the same health outcomes and the same socio-economic kind of mix, they need it more. So actually the way that we ask people to apply for funding and the way that we kind of ask people as a whole collective to engage with projects can actually deliberately exclude people.